Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. I have a great guest coming up, Mark Meckler. He's back, Convention of States Action, COS Project. We're going to talk to him about everything that's going on in D.C., the cesspool that it is, and how we could begin to take back this country where it's for we the people once again, instead of for we the elites, right? Because that's what it seems. Mark, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm good. Glad to be with you again.
Well, I'm glad you could be here. I saw your tweet or X or whatever they're calling it these days a few weeks ago where Congress passed that $100 billion foreign aid package. They were all cheering on the floor with Ukrainian flags. I wish I saw that excitement when they passed legislation for we the people, or hopefully they don't pass legislation, because every time it seems like they do, they just screw things up. How much faith do you have in both Republicans and Democrats to get the fiscal house in order?
Yeah, none. Absolutely zero. I mean, there's really nobody even in Washington, D.C. calling for it. It's really interesting. You know, I started my political career about 15 years ago at the height of the Tea Party. And that was a clarion call of the Tea Party, was to balance the budget and get our fiscal house in order. Whole bunch of people elected on that platform. Today, I don't really hear anybody calling for it. Certainly, Donald Trump spent more than any president before him in history. I love Donald Trump, lots to love about him. The spending wasn't one of those things. And so I just don't have a lot of hope that Congress is ever going to do this on their own.
Yeah, it's depressing. I mean, you look at it and you see the way they just spend our tax dollars, and it's not like they spend it wisely. They don't prudently spend it. It basically goes to special interests, right? Whether it's the military industrial complex, whether it's the green energy industry. I mean, this is what we've been witnessing over the last several decades, is it not?
No, it is what we've been witnessing, and it's really frustrating. And I would argue it doesn't matter what the department is, whether you're talking Department of Defense or welfare programs, education, energy, environment, waste in all of them, even the ones that we need. Obviously, I believe in a strong national defense, but the idea that we couldn't cut money out of that if we actually audited, if people were actually held to account, is ridiculous.
Are you telling me that we don't need maternity flight suits because pregnant women that are 7, 8 months pregnant are not going to go in a fighter jet?
Yeah, no maternity flight suits. And look, I just think that there's so much waste built in there. We know it. Everybody knows it. Nobody's willing to do anything about it. One of the things that really frustrates me, Nick, is we are an incredibly wealthy country. We have the money to do the things we need to do if we would literally just dig in and quit wasting it. It's the problem is that every dollar has a constituency.
Yeah, that is the problem. One of the things that aggravates me, and you said it before, you know, the whole Tea Party movement, it used to be Republicans and conservatives. They would actually campaign on the idea of fiscal responsibility and limited government. And when they got into positions of power, when they got elected on that platform, they spent money just like the Democrats do. Right. But now they don't even talk about it anymore. I mean, there's a few that do, but most don't even want to approach the subject anymore. They just ignore it. And how do we get the politicians to respond to the American people?
Look, I think the only way that we can do it, I hate to keep tooting the same horn, but I think the only way is to call a convention of states. Human beings are incentive machines, and right now there's no incentive for cutting the budget. If they cut anything they cut, they're going to get screamed at about. There's a constituency for every dollar of spending. So you have to create a constitutional mechanism that forces them. That way they can go back to their constituents to say, look, I'm forced to do this. You know, there's only so much money to go around. We're required to balance the budget. Not allowed to raise taxes, which is what it should be under a balanced budget amendment. And so that means I've got to do these cuts, and we have to figure out where. That's the only way I believe Congress will ever make the cuts.
Yeah, and let's be honest. I mean, I could guarantee you could probably cut 15 to 20% off every single government program, and nobody would feel a thing. You probably wouldn't even have to lay off a single federal worker. That's how much waste is in it. But anytime we do see a politician attempt to bring up the subject of getting the fiscal house in order. Take, for instance, Senator Rick Scott of Florida. He is someone that does go out there. He does speak about fiscal responsibility. He calls for the reforming Social Security and Medicare, that these programs have been completely mismanaged, that they're not sustainable in their current form. And then they get skewered.
Right.
So looking at public perception and how, you're right, there's always a constituency out there. Everyone says you need to cut funding, but unless it's a program I'm using, then you can't cut that program. That's the most important program that exists. Is there a way to start persuading the American people that, hey, we're on a sinking ship right now, and we either make the incremental cuts today or we're going to be gutting entire programs 20 years down the road?
Yeah, I do think you're bringing up something which is one of my favorite subjects, which is narrative. And the way that you talk about a subject matters as much about your ideas or the substance of the subject. And so one of the things that I think is really important, for example, on Social Security and Medicare, is to tell people they're going to steal this program from you. They are going to shut this program down because the money is not there to sustain it. And so what we should be is we should come out as the party that is for Medicare, the party that is for Social Security, the party that is for preserving the social safety net. But in order to do that, we have to do some simple things like, look, guys like me, I'm 62 years old, push back my legal retirement age by a few years. You're a lot younger than me. Push back your legal retirement age by a few more years than that. If we do that, that's how we save those programs. If we don't do that, it's one big lie. And someday somebody's going to cross the finish line and hold their hand out for that check. It's just not going to be there.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because it's simple common sense, especially when you look at, people are living longer in this day and age. I know life expectancy has fallen in the United States largely due to the opioid epidemic, but the reality is that people are living longer. I am going to live longer than previous generation, as are you. And so why wouldn't it be tied to life expectancy to some degree? And I love when, you have those people, the young people say, well, that's not fair. I shouldn't have to work longer. But if you're older and healthier, why not?
Well, the math on Social Security when it began was retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 63. So most people weren't even expected to live long enough to collect their Social Security. And now we have life expectancy for males about 81. So you go 65 to 81. The program's just mathematically upside down. And then if you combine that with the declining birth rate, which is where we're at, it used to take, we would have 2 to 3 workers for every person who was retired. Now we have like 1 worker, half a worker for every person retired. You just can't do it. It's unsustainable. And so again, I think the appropriate narrative is that we are the people who want to save Social Security, including my dog here, who's deciding to jump in with us.
Well, he's so engaged in the conversation and he wanted to jump in and give us his thoughts. Now, Mark, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk to you about the future trajectory of the country. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Mark, we got to try and understand the future trajectory of the United States, because it seems like partly due to the failed education system, partly due to the sense of entitlement that we've been seeing over the last few years, really the last few decades, that everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. Nobody wants to make the tough choices anymore. That's what it appears. Nobody wants to make these tough choices. Nobody wants to have to sacrifice. And what's happened to the culture of the United States that's gotten us to this point?
I think so many handouts does create an entitlement mentality when you believe the government's always going to be there. You're not responsible for taking care of yourself. You're not responsible for your own choices. You're going to end up with a culture that has an entitlement mentality. There's another factor, though, which is nobody wants to be the sucker. And so if you say to me, hey, Mark, I want you to push back your Social Security or take less in Social Security, I'm going to say, fine, I agree to that. Americans are very willing to sacrifice. We're the most charitable people on earth if we believe it will make a difference. And so if I believe I'm going to agree to these cuts and that money's just going to be wasted, or it's going to go to somebody who is going to be irresponsible, then of course I don't want to be the sucker that gives up my check. But if I believe it's actually going to go to pay down the debt, it's actually going to go to save the program, then I think Americans are happy to sacrifice. Important to remember, Nick, there's no means testing on Social Security. So I want you to think about that. Somebody who's worth $1 billion, let's say, $100 million, $50 million, they're set for their retirement. They're going to collect their $1,500 or $3,000 a month in Social Security. I just think that's outrageous. Why should we be paying people like that when there were tens of millions of dollars? Look, there's an argument. People say, I paid my money in, but we shouldn't look at it that way. It shouldn't be a defined benefits program. It should be defined contribution, and then you get it back on means testing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at most government programs, or at least many of them, they are actually means tested. Like, just because I pay taxes doesn't mean I'm going to get financial aid to go to college. You're going to have to means test it. It makes perfect sense. Another problem that we have is just the Biden open border policy, right? I mean, I think it's estimated that under his leadership, it's going to end up being about 12 million people that have illegally come to the United States, which is interesting because they've been using the 12 million illegal immigrants since like 2005, and as if no one else came in since then. But in any event, when we look at it, a lot of people are worried that there's some real damage that could be done, not necessarily in the voting, right? I mean, Republicans right now are trying to pass the bill to prevent illegal immigrants from voting, but that's actually easy to detect. My concern is more of the United States Census that's going to take place in 2030, where you have states like California, New York that are bleeding populations, but they're getting in this illegal immigrant population now, and that could give them overrepresentation. Why would that be a perfect thing for the Convention of States project?
Like, I think it's absolutely outrageous. The idea that we're going to count illegal immigrants in the census for representation when they have no right to be represented in the United States Congress. Representation is all about citizenship. We as citizens elect our representatives, and then they serve for everybody that's in the country, but it's up to citizens. So what you're talking about is they are now filling blue states with people who are here illegally. They are counting them. They got counted in the 2020 census. Right now, so I would argue somewhere between 5 and 15 seats in the United States Congress belong to Democrats that would belong to Republicans if it were not this way of counting illegals in the census. And they're going to try and get that number up to 25 or 30. So in a convention of states, we could actually prohibit the counting of anybody except for citizens. Now, I think we should do this in advance of a convention. They could do it just by passing legislation to do it. I'm hoping if Republicans take control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, that they do this before the next census.
Yeah, you would think that they would have done that in 2017 when they did have the House and the Senate and the presidency. But of course, it's Republicans we're talking about. I mean, they know how to screw up a sure thing.
Absolutely.
But when we examine it, I think you're right. It is about 15 House seats because MIT and I think it was either Stanford or Yale did a joint study. They estimate, and this is prior to 2020, that between 22 million and 26 million illegal immigrants were in the United States, not 12 million. Now you factor another additional 12 million on top of that, you're talking about over 30 million Americans, 10% of the population roughly. That's certainly enough to swing elections, is it not?
Yeah, it is absolutely, and more than enough to swing elections. Certainly more than enough when you put those seats into blue states. A lot of those blue states have more representation. But part of the reason they do this a census is they want to enumerate how many people are in each state for purposes of federal benefits. We can talk about that, the whole benefit thing. But aside from that, there's a reason that they're doing this enumeration of the population. But we absolutely should not be counting it for purposes of representation.
And if those that are legally here are getting, I'm in New York, it's a cesspool here, right, where you have people getting $1,300 to $2,000 on debit cards. You have hotel stays, food supplied, healthcare. I mean, I know plenty of Americans that have difficulty with healthcare. They're not getting any benefit. Education costs, because we are a humane nation. We do believe that we should provide educations if it's a child, regardless of whether they're here legally or not, because we don't want them hanging out on the streets. So you look at the cost to the American people, and it's just another example of the fiscal irresponsibility. But more importantly, if you are illegally here and you're getting every benefit a citizen gets, maybe even plus some, what is the point of citizenship?
Yeah, I think that's what they're intending to do, is destroy the point of citizenship, destroy the citizen. Victor Davis Hanson wrote a great book about this. I think it came out last year, called The Dying Citizen. Really extraordinary, talking about exactly what you're bringing up, the idea that we have certain rights, a package of rights that come with being a citizen. And the more they give those to non-citizens, the more irrelevant it becomes to be a citizen. There's no incentive structure to be a citizen. And in fact, as you described, in some circumstances, there's actually a disincentive.
Agreed. And I think it goes back to the Convention of States and why the Convention of States is important. Now, people do have concerns about the Convention of States, and you hear a lot of talk about this idea of a runaway convention. So I want to take that up with you when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Mark, the idea of a runaway convention, that it's going to get out of control. People are going to propose all these constitutional amendments. The entire Constitution is going to get rewritten. That's not really likely. I mean, we've spoken about this before, but I think it's important to really tackle this, straight on with people that are skeptical about what a convention of states will do. So when it comes to a runaway convention, is unlikely. So can you explain to the audience why it's unlikely and why the concerns are overblown when it comes to this idea of a runaway convention?
Yeah, I hear this from people on the right all the time. Look, if you're on the right and you're worried about the idea of a runaway convention, meaning that we get into a convention of states and the delegates could go rogue and they could propose things like the repeal of the Second Amendment, there's a couple things I want people to remember about that. Number one, you are using leftist talking points. And this is really important. If you're a conservative, you're watching, I assume you're watching this show. You need to know that that's coming from the left. You can find that exact talking point on the Common Cause George Soros website. You can find 250 leftist groups, Planned Parenthood, La Raza, MoveOn.org, Hillary Clinton, Russ Feingold, who all use that talking point. They invented that talking point to keep people like you and me from using a convention of states. And so let me just do some really simple math for you. I'm from California, went to school in Los Angeles, so the only math I know is simple math because I went to public school in California. But if you look at the Second Amendment, there are currently 29 states. Florida just became the 29th that have constitutional carry. It means you don't need a permit to carry a weapon in those states. Unfortunately, not New York, but yeah, maybe someday. And so we have 29 states that allow that. You have actually 24 states that allow you to carry your handgun in the legislature. You have 14 states that allow you to take a long gun like an AR, put one in the chamber, sling it across your back, and sit in the gallery and watch the proceedings. Not saying that's a good idea, but the idea that any of those states are going to repeal the Second Amendment is outrageous. And think about it this way. It takes only 13 states to stop any amendment, actually one house in each of 13 states. So we have this protection of the 13 most conservative states in America. And I'll give you a clue about how conservative America really is, broadly speaking. Texas is not among the top 13 conservative states in America.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I kind of figured that because you do see some blue tendencies in the blue pockets in Texas. But at the same time, I think it's important to highlight that when it comes to the idea of an overwhelming majority, there's a reason the founding fathers believed that the state should operate with an overwhelming majority when passing constitutional amendment. Just like if we did it the first way through Congress, you still need an overwhelming majority as well. That really the power lies with the states when it comes to the idea of amendments and ratification.
Yeah, one of the things I like to talk about when I'm talking about the sort of balance of power between states and the federal government is the states are the parents. The parents created this, the federal government, and they're in charge. And for any of you out there who've been parents or grandparents, you know what happens if you let your children run wild and you give them no rails on which to run. You give them no lines outside of which they cannot go. They're going to be terrible children. They're going to do terrible things. They're going to take advantage of it because that's human nature. They're going to go as far as you let them go. And sometimes parents let them go all the way. And we see these kids out there. We see them running around on campus now pretending to be Nazi Hamas members, right? And so this is what happens. So if we as the adults in the room, we as the states don't use our parental authority over the federal government, then we shouldn't complain when the federal government runs amok.
And isn't this the reason why just about every single issue has become federalized over the last several decades? I mean, it seems like the second something happens, everyone looks to the federal government to solve the problem. Is that not the case?
I think that's true. And the federal government looks to itself. You know, one of the things that drives me crazy is we have all these different debates, whatever it is, about what should we do? Should we have universal health care, not universal health care? How much is federalized? How much not federalized? We talk about what's the right relative tax burden? How big should the IRS be? You know, should we have the 87,000 new agents or not have them? The underlying premise of every single one of those arguments is that the smart people in Washington will decide. And number one, I would say the smart people aren't in Washington. If you spend any time there, I know you have, it's very unimpressive. There are singularly unimpressive people in DC.
100%.
And by the way, if you haven't been there and spent any time there, you need to understand that running Congress are mostly what I would describe as kids. You know, they're 23 to 26 years old. So the majority of the staffers on the Hill, they're making things happen. They're deciding what happens. And so if we're entrusting our future to the smart people in DC, that's a mistake. The reality is the debate that we should be having, the fundamental debate, is not what should we do? It should be who decides. My friend Ken Ivory, who's in the legislature in Utah, great constitutionalist, one of the things he always says is there's two questions you have to ask yourself when the government's about to do anything. Number one is if government, like, should we really even have government involved in this? Is this a government issue? And then if you say yes to if government, the question is, well, which government, right? Should it be the federal government, or should it be a state, or maybe even a municipality, right? Or a school board? I mean, I believe in something called subsidiarity, which means we should make the decisions as close to the people being affected by those decisions as possible. So that, to give you an example, why are people in Washington, D.C. deciding what people in a suburb outside of New York should do with their education? They shouldn't. It should be that suburb and those parents in that school district.
Well, and I'm going to get to that in 1 second, but like when you brought up universal healthcare, I constantly say, you know, if California wants to do universal healthcare, they can. Why screw it up for 49 other states? If California succeeds, other states will adopt it. If they fail miserably, then other states are going to reject it. Why screw everything up for the entirety of the United States is beyond me. But when you just brought up education, isn't the part of the problem is the states themselves that have relinquished their sovereignty through grant funding? Essentially, the federal government bribing the states to adopt policies they normally wouldn't adopt. And do you think that this is a reason some states push back against the idea of a convention of states? Because potentially the convention of states will say, hey, fiscal responsibility, get your fiscal houses in order on the federal level and state level.
Yeah, I do think that. And so there's two layers to that I think are important. One is, you know, people think that the framers of the Constitution were infallible, and that's outrageous. There was one infallibly human that ever walked the earth. The rest of us are a mess. And so the thing that the framers got wrong when they drafted the Constitution was a philosophical idea. They believed that the states would always protect their interests, that they would jealously protect their powers. And the states have failed to do that. The states are very comfortable taking money from the federal government. But I also think the framers didn't understand, they didn't believe that the federal government would start spending all this money on state issues. That certainly wasn't being done at the time of the framing of the Constitution or even shortly thereafter. So the idea that the federal government would start pouring all this money into the states and essentially bribing the states to do what the federal government wanted didn't exist. And I think we need to do away with that. I think we need to make that unconstitutional. But I also want to say, look, I'm not trying to take money away from the states. A lot of this money comes from the states to the federal government and then back to the states. States are either donor states or recipient states. For example, New York is a donor state. New York gives more money to the federal government than New York receives.
For now. As Wall Street leaves and Manhattan goes down, I think that may change.
Well, so the question is, why? Like, why should New Yorkers be okay? Why should New York spend money? And I'm going to do it backwards of what we normally think of the normal red-blue thing. Mississippi is one of the biggest recipient states in the country, a welfare state. Why are New Yorkers paying for the bad decisions being made in Mississippi? Why are Californians? California is another donor state right now. Why are Californians paying for the bad ideas or whatever it is causing Mississippi to be upside down? That should be on Mississippi. And it should go both directions, right? One state should not pay for the bad decisions, ideas, bad governance in another state. Let the money stay in the states and not go out to the federal government in the first place.
100%. And I think that is so important especially when it comes to the states and the idea of the founding fathers. There's one thing that always sticks out when you talk about the founding fathers and you state that they came in as men, but they left as statesmen. And that always sticks with me when you say that. Where are the statesmen today?
Look, I think they're everywhere. I think you got to hang out with a bunch of them. You served as a commissioner at our simulated convention. This is the thing. We've done two of those now. The thing that I saw that to me is more important than anything else I saw. It's not just how the convention ran. It's how people came in from all over the country, people like you, I think really good people with good intentions. And they became great when they went into convention. It changed them. They're there, they're dealing with the most important document in our land, the foundational document, and they rose to the challenge. And I see this all over the country. There are a lot of people I would trust in convention. One of the most sort of what I would call insulting things that I hear people say or opposed to the idea of a convention of states is they say, well, there's no Madison or Adams or, all these great patriots, Franklin's left today. That is so outrageous. Such an arrogant, amazingly, stunningly arrogant thing to say. And I can refute that absolutely. I've been all over the country. I meet people like you, but people say, oh, no, there's nobody like this in New York. New York's full of great patriots. I've been all over New York, smart, educated, common sense, love God, love their country, love their families. And I'd sit them down with any of the patriots from the founding era. And I think they could sit in a room and work these problems out. And that's true whether you're in a red state or a blue state. I think there are great patriots all over this country who are equal to the caliber of the framers.
I agree, and I think that people underestimate, their power within the system. And I understand they're depressed, they're demoralized. It seems like everything's coming at once. But if people just stood up and spoke up, half this nonsense wouldn't even be happening. So, what's on the horizon for convention of states? What do you guys got planned for the next few months?
Well, I think there's one thing I want to say before we go to that, which is you just talked about people being depressed and demoralized. Remember, that's what the enemy wants. If you're watching this and you think, yeah, but Mark and Nick, there's no chance, and they steal the vote and woke kids on school campuses and gender ideology and CRT and ESG and whatever other acronym you want to bring up, DIE, right? You think all that stuff, and then you think, oh, there's just nothing we can do, then you're right. Because they just beat you. They defeated you with just news, with bleakness, and you're giving up. I'll never give up, first of all. Never, ever, never give up. It's important.
That's why I'm so mad at so many people that left New York. I'm not willing to surrender my state. I'm here for the long haul.
Yeah, don't give up. I believe we're going to take those states back eventually. You got to stick it out and fight for it. And I look, and to the people who left, by the way, people have their own personal lines. Like I left California because I didn't want to bring my kids back there. I wanted them to go somewhere there was opportunity. I knew they would follow me. But to the people who stay, God bless you for being in the fight. That's why I still go. This year I was in Colorado, which is a blue state now. I was in Connecticut not too long ago at their capital. And when I go to those capitals, by the way, they're packed with patriots. We had over 100 people show up in Connecticut. I didn't know there were 100 people in Connecticut, but we had over 100 people there in the capital. We overwhelmed that capital. It was awesome. So don't get depressed. Don't get demoralized. There's lots of great stuff going on out there. If you look at the polling right now for Donald Trump, it's unbelievable. It's like nothing we've ever seen. He's ridiculously far ahead in all the swing states right now. Would you have predicted that 6 or 8 months ago? I wouldn't.
No, right? Certainly not. I mean, I still think it's an unpredictable election given everything that's going on and variables that we can't compare to any previous election. But interesting, while I'm suspect of the polls today, there's one thing that's undeniable, and that's following the movement. And all the movement has been towards him. And I think as the swamp continues to go after him, as Democrats continue to target political opponents, I suspect that I don't see that changing unless somehow, some way, Bidenomics really changes and actually works for people. Because right now it ain't working. No matter, despite what he says, that the American people are dumb, they just don't know how good the economy is. The economy is terrible, and everyone's struggling in it.
So I look at, like you said, any one poll I couldn't care less about because, you just don't know. One poll could be an outlier, but when you look at the trend lines on the polling, all the trend lines are moving in the right direction. If you follow politics, it's important to peak at the right time. And when you look at the trend lines, Biden's declining at exactly the right time for somebody like me and you. Trump is increasing. And all the factors that are causing those things to happen look like they're unchangeable at this point, I would argue. The economy is not going to recover in the last 6 months. There's nothing fundamental that could make that happen. Inflation is going to continue to increase over the next 6 months. The foreign policy arena is going to continue to be a disaster. Biden is not going to secure the border because his base will not allow it, his fringe base, radical base. And so I look at all of those things and I have hope. I'm not Pollyannish. I would tell you, if you're looking at if you listen to me, one underlying thing I want to tell you is don't get cocky, work, work, work. Don't stop until midnight when the polls close, pretty much when the last votes can be pushed through the doors. And if you're an individual, make sure everybody you know who thinks like you votes. That means your parents, your kids, people you go to church with, people you're at work with, and be the person who hassles them. Have you voted yet? I mean, if you haven't voted yet, you need to get out and vote. And I would push them. I ask everybody, make a list of 10 people who you really want to vote and you're worried they may not vote, and you be their minder and be responsible for that. That's enough to swing an election.
100%, especially when you look at voter turnout. You get an additional 5% of people to turn out. That's it. And I argue to every Republican, even if the polls show you up by 5 points, pretend you're down by 5 points.
Yeah.
I'll also remind it is a Republican year for the Senate because Democrats are on the defensive in the Senate. So that's another good thing. So as far as convention of states goes, what do you have going on over there?
So right now, this week, I'm getting ready to head to North Carolina. North Carolina, we've already passed the House. I think we're going to pass the Senate. I never like to predict, but it looks good. All the fundamentals are in place. I'm going to be there on Wednesday with Rick Santorum and Mike Ferris. And I think we're going to have over 1,000 people there at the legislature, which is an overwhelming number to produce at a legislature. Those people will then go inside after our rally. They'll lobby their state legislators. That's just fundamental grassroots politics. That's how you force change on a legislature. So North Carolina, Kansas, we passed last year, but there's a pending litigation around that. I think that litigation is going to finish up in the next 90 days. So I think those will be states number 20 and 21. And then I look at Pennsylvania. We just came out of the committee in the Senate in Pennsylvania. We're headed to the floor. I think the Senate looks really good. The House is a longer stretch for us, but I think we can get it done there. Ohio looks good. These are year-round legislatures, which I don't like normally, but gives us more time for COS. So I think Ohio looks good. The leadership in both houses is in support. Senate President Huffman is a big fan of Article 5. I think we get it across the line. So those are the states that I'm looking at right now. And then the rest is prepping for 2025. We're always looking to the next legislative session. That's why I just came back from South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, 2 stops in South Dakota, because I'm promoting those legislatures. I think those 3 are hot to trot in 2025, along with Idaho. So a bunch of cluster of states right there. I think it looks like a very good end of year and beginning of next year for Convention of States.
Yeah, and I think everyone needs to check out Convention of States action, and they need to sign up, stay aware of what's going on with the COS project. And we're going to have links up at the PAS report, PASreport.com. Mark, always enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, God bless you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for keeping up the fight there in New York.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.